And now we're going to hand it over to Masha Sedova, and she's going to be talking about users and where to find them. Please, Masha.
Thank you.
Click is in my hand.
Oh, clicker.
Down button.
Got it. Thanks. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Masha Sedova, and taking a sharp turn from cotton candy flux to high-risk users and where to find them. I'm really excited to talk to you all about this particular topic because, as many of you may be aware, users, the human element, is a huge reason why our organizations are getting hacked on an ongoing basis. And if we can make even marginal steps forward in identifying where these high-risk users are, we can change the landscape of how we can defend our organizations and actually get proactive. So I'm going to walk through how we can do that and how we can rethink this problem in a whole new way. I've come to this particular topic by way of being a security practitioner for almost 2 decades now. Started my career working for the DoD as a cyber analyst. In 2012, had the opportunity of building and running a team at Salesforce focused on all elements of human risk, everything from the unintentional and the careless user all the way through malicious. And in 2017, co-founded a company called Elevate Security, which is a platform that helps enterprises measure their risky users and then adapt their security based on that information. And this presentation is a combination of 2 really exciting parts that I'm bringing together. One of them is a unique set of research that we just completed. The paper itself is being published next Tuesday, but there's a link at the end for an advanced copy. And it's a first of its kind data set that looks at risky user behavior, and we're going to unpack that in a lot of detail together. The second half is what to do with this information, and that leverages my experience in working with enterprises around the world around taking action on this data. So with that, let's jump in. So in my time working on this problem set, I have come to realize that user risk is one of the largest unsolved problems in security. As you all know, security is a cat and mouse game, and we've made immense improvement around so many aspects of security. The way this industry looked 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it barely resembles what we're dealing with today. We've made huge leaps in data and how we, data security and network security, even in identity. And yet the human element is exactly the same 20 years ago as it is today, where we all have to go through the same boring training and we just say, oh, users are the weakest link, too bad, right? And it remains our Achilles heel. And while it is unstudied and unexplored, it will continue to be our Achilles heel. So we understand this is a big problem, but I wanted to just unpack exactly how big of a problem it is. According to the Verizon Data Breach Report of this last year, 82% of all the incidents that they looked at were rooted in the human element. 82%. Almost 40% of those were phishing, and about 24% used social attacks, so hacking of stolen credentials. And if we translate that into dollar figures, if we take a look at the largest breaches that have happened in the last 5 years, close to $15 billion are attributed lost to the human element. So there is a significant number of things we are cleaning up, and it is costing us a lot of money. So if we can make even a small fraction of advancement around how we think about this problem space, we're going to change the landscape of how we can defend our organization. But in order for us to do that, we need to figure out what the heck we're measuring, because we can't manage this risk if we don't understand how to measure it. So the way that we think about measuring user risk today is this very much one-size-fits-all approach. Employees in an organization tend to be this bucketed group where we send training at everybody, hope they complete the training, and that's it. But if we're going to actually manage it, we're going to need to take a deeper step around this and actually start quantifying it. And so we need to get to the place where we begin to understand that risk is not distributed evenly across users, and that there are people who are riskier than others, and there are people who are excellent security champions. And maybe you, as security practitioners in your roles, may have an understanding of this anecdotally, but if we can start taking a look at this from a data perspective, we can start doing some really interesting things, including mapping these users into cohorts where you can understand, okay, we have low-risk users, medium-risk, and high-risk users, and we can then start applying and focusing our energy and our resources in a much more effective, tailored way based on the risk that an individual presents. what I'm saying here is not necessarily rocket science, it's risk management 101, and we apply it to how we think about prioritizing our incidents and how we prioritize our vulnerabilities and how we think about managing our audit findings, but we never do this around managing user risk. And so the first step in order for us to be able to manage user risk is to be able to create this kind of quantification. So how do we go about this? The good news is there are other industries who have already piloted and thought about measuring risky users, but into a different capacity. So if we think about credit scores as a model, credit scores, credit companies think about creating an individual score for a person based on a couple of factors, the majority of which are an individual's past decisions as it relates to credit and debt handling. We can use that information to better understand how likely someone is to default on debt, and therefore how trustworthy are they with certain amounts of and certain sums of debt. And so we can apply similar kind of thinking, understanding a person's past behaviors, to try to apply a security model around this. And so what we can think about from a security perspective is creating essentially a CVSS score, but for an employee or for an individual, based on a couple of different factors worth considering. So the first is what kind of security decisions employees are making, good and bad. Do they click on links? Do they navigate to sites that are blocked? Do they try to download and execute malware on their machines? Do they have known violations? Do they try to mishandle sensitive data? So understanding how frequently they make these decisions and how severe these decisions are critical to help map this. The second factor that's worth considering is what is the access level of an individual? What is the blast radius of a bad decision? So if your intern makes a bad decision and your CFO makes a bad decision, both of those, even if it's the same decision, like clicking on phishing, they're going to have vastly different impacts in your organization. And then the third category is the frequency of attack. Because not every one of our employees and part of our workforce has to be subject to the same amount of attacker scrutiny, and so we need to understand who needs to be more resilient than others. And so what we've done, my team at Elevate Security in partnership with some amazing data scientists at Scientia, took a look at one of the most unique data sets that I'm aware of in the industry today, and that was about 15 million unique data points of employees across organizations, about 200,000 employees, and security decisions that they took over about an 8-year period. And this covered close to 4,000 departments across dozens of companies. So this next part of the presentation is the analysis of this data set. So the very first thing that we wanted to take a look at is say, what can we understand about phishing? So phishing is a ubiquitous problem no matter what organization you're in, what part of the world. We want to see, are there any lessons or lessons that the data can teach us and lessons learned around phishing? So the first thing that I wanted to show you is this attack frequency. What you see here is the number of phishing messages received by an individual. So on the very left-hand side, you'll see that 52% of the users in our data sets never sent a phishing attack that was detected by our systems. So by the systems in place, by the email gateway solutions in place. So 52% never received an email. And there's this smattering on the right-hand side that shows that on a median, 33 phishing emails are delivered to individuals who did receive one. So that's kind of interesting. There's about this is the first place we're splitting our population, right? About half never even get one. They don't even get to make a decision about whether or not they should click a link. And the other half are getting them, some obviously more so than others. If we unpack the population that is getting phishing emails, I want to bring your attention to this bar at the top, right? The blue and the red bar at the top. Of employees and users who receive 10 or more phishing emails, 80% of them never click it. These are awesome people, right? These are people who are getting real attacks and never click it. So this is another place where we're dividing the population. But on the right-hand side, we're seeing about 21% are clicking at least one phishing email. So then we wanted to take a step further into the data set and said, okay, so of these 21%, how many times are they clicking? And this is what the red bars at the bottom show us. So we can see that of employees who do click, most of them click 10% or less, which is about 1 in 10 clicks. So overall, pretty good. I mean, they're still clicking on links, so still risky, but not too bad. And if we go all the way to the right-hand side, there's the unique and very special population of people who will click on everything you send them. So 0.8% click more than 80% of the phishing emails sent to them. So this is where we say, oh, it only takes one. Yeah, those folks live in that part of the chart. And the place that, the thing that I really want to take away from all this chart is that, again, we have at least 4 different populations here. People who never get phishing emails, people who do and they don't click, people that do get it and only click once, quickly learn the lesson and move on, and then people who are hopeless, right? And how you're going to manage all 4 of those populations can and should be different. So let's take a look at malware next. And I want to bring your attention to the red part of this chart. What you see on the left-hand side of this is how many users account for, on the right-hand side, the number of events associated with that. So what you see here is 2.7% of the users we took a look at were responsible for 92% of all malware events. Now, this is actually a pretty good story in that, and because the blue area is so great. It means 96% of the users we looked at never even had a malware event. Honestly, I think this is one of the best stories of security where we have eliminated many opportunities for people to, as the talk earlier this morning said, electrocute themselves in the bathtub with a hairdryer, right? This is the GFCI example in malware, right? People can no longer hurt themselves on malware as much as they used to. That said, there's still this 2.7% that exists. Ransomware still makes the news, right? Because there's a small percentage of users who are introducing a significant number of events for us. The next behavior we took a look at was secure browsing, so insecure browsing and browsing violations. And these were the number of employees who ended up on a site that had malicious or questionable content as defined by the enterprise and the policies of the organization. This is a really interesting data set, not because it's necessarily as risky as malware, but there's a lot larger of a distribution. There's a lot more opportunities for us to track when an employee makes kind of riskier decisions here. Malware occurs quite rarely, whereas browsing decisions happen on an ongoing basis. And you see, even though it's a little bit more distributed, still about 12% of our populations account for about 71% of browsing violations. So once we took a look and we start seeing this pattern that a small number of employees were responsible for a large number of violations, we started asking the questions, are there ways that we can start benchmarking what a high-risk user looks like across enterprises? Now, this is a very organizational specific definition because in one organization, one phishing click could equate to a high-risk user, where in another organization it could be 20. So we decided to look at the data and say that of the people who made security mistakes, either in browsing, malware, or phishing, those that fall in the top quartile of users are defined as high-risk users. And once we took a look at that population, some really interesting trends started to occur. We started being able to create this median threshold mapping and a maxima threshold. So of the high-risk users who made these risky decisions, they, on a median level, had a phishing click-through rate of 8%. The worst offenders in this category had 14%. Simulated phishing was interesting because it had a pretty wide gap, so 10% with a maximum of 22, but not as wide as the secure browsing, which for me was a pretty big shock. That median browsing violations was about 3.7, but the worst organization of 177 was their maximum threshold of risk. So why I, as a security practitioner, am incredibly excited about this is for the first time, I can effectively answer the question, how many risky users in my organization do I have? If I say that my employees, on average, 10% or 20% click on phishing, am I a good organization or a bad organization? What is my level of risk? How exposed am I? Am I doing better than my peers or am I doing worse? By being able to pull this data set and create these median thresholds, we finally have a way of benchmarking and saying, you know what, I'm doing better in some areas and worse than in other areas. So we can finally start actually being able to say, do I need to apply more resources in this problem space or can I back off? When we take a look at these particular thresholds, we find that on average, about 12.8% of a population falls into the high-risk category. So why do we care about these high-risk employees other than they're making mistakes? We found that high-risk employees account for a disproportionately large number of negative events. These are the people that make security into a janitorial job, where we are constantly cleaning up after these people's mistakes. And there are these repeat offenders who are making these mistakes again and again. So these high-risk users, this 12% of populations, account for 30% of clicking on real-world phishing attacks, 41% of clicking on simulated phishing attacks, 54% of browsing violation incidents, and 42% of malware events. So what this means is if we can get ahead of high-risk users, understanding who's making what kind of mistakes, who are repeat offenders here, we're going to start seeing significant reductions in these areas because, again, this is the place where they're causing us a lot of pain from a security perspective. Okay, so now some interactive time. We wanted to ask the data, where do these high-risk users reside? Are there any patterns around this? And I really love this conversation because I find that there's actually a lot of stereotypes, depending on where you work, as to where you think users, these high-risk users are and which department's the worst. So I'd love for folks to shout out, which department do you think has the highest amount of high-risk users? IT, HR, security, engineering, sales, or a CEO. Okay, sounds like everyone's got a personal story. Really interesting. Someone that I heard IT up front. I actually hear IT as sort of the benchmark of what good looks like. But the punchline here is customer service by quite a long shot. 22% of customer service individuals were high risk, with R&D following in not too far behind, and 18%. Honestly, it's kind of a terrifying concept to me. IT, as you can see here, is 8.5, and we particularly highlighting it because, again, many organizations consider IT to be tech savvy, and tech savvy equals somehow more secure. But again, 8% here, but you'll see that many organizations hover around the 10%. Customer service blowing everybody out of the water. We then wanted to unpack a little bit deeper and say, well, these are the number of high-risk users across all behaviors. Do the type of behaviors change? So there's a lot of data on this, and if you would like to dig in, you all have access to the slides. But I wanted to point out a couple of things. Medical lab, zero instances of malware, and egregiously high numbers. In fact, they take the chart on secure browsing and real phishing. So not all risk is distributed evenly. Clearly, the type of work for employees in this kind of department lends itself much more to riskier browsing and phishing. So when we think about remediation, we might think about helping folks with these kind of areas of risk. Customer service. They've clearly figured out how to detect real phishing attacks, but are terrible at the simulated phishing. This is a shocking finding to me. And on the other end of this, the R&D group, they seem to have phishing, both real and simulated, fine, but browsing is not in their capabilities. And for those folks who said marketing, before I did the analysis of the data and actually dug in there, I thought marketing was going to be the worst. Marketing is the worst in malware, but tends to be okay in the other categories. So some interesting findings there. And again, why I think looking at data it's so critical before we start leaning into assumptions and stereotypes and oh, Bob in finance is the worst. We should definitely put sanctions on finance. Using data to understand where risk really lies. All right, next question for you all. Managers or non-managers? Raise your hand if you think managers are riskier. Okay, and non-managers? Okay, the audience thinks managers are worse. The punchline is managers are worse, yes. Yeah, with exception of 3 departments, HR, QA, and sales, managers pretty much across the board tend to have more high-risk employees there. 17% of managers were high-risk, not managers, close, but not that close, about 12%. And next question, contractors or non-contractors? Okay, raise your hands if you think contractors. Okay, non-contractors? Oh yeah, not a lot of contractor love here. It's actually not contractors. I know. Again, surprised me too. There was, with exception of the board, which is great. There's no contractors on the board, and creative, which was a tagging issue, and from our data perspective, purchasing. And then I want to point out, sales was actually pretty close. So contractors in purchasing, sales were the exception to the rule, but in general, non-contractors tended to be riskier. Okay, and the last question, who's worse? The CEO / the C-suite, middle managers, or frontline employees? Okay, CEO, raise your hand. Middle managers, frontline employees. All right, you all think middle managers, by the way, and you would be right. So if you see this bar chart here at the bottom level, so this is the distance to the C-suite. So it starts at the bottom level on the left-hand side and moves up to the C-suite on the right. And as you can see, that there is a clear spike in the middle of high-risk employees in middle management. My thinking on this is because middle managers probably have to deal with most amount of external vendor contracting kind of conversations than compared to C-suite or bottom level, so may be exposed to greater risk that way. Okay, so that is a little bit about where high-risk users are hiding. But if I just left it there, that would you'd be like, okay, great. I should just not trust anyone in CS that's in management. Done. But that's not actually going to be an effective way. So the next part of the talk is going to go into how we actually action on this data and what we do with this. And the punchline is no, we should not fire 12% of the organization. And no, we're not going to electrocute them every time they make a mistake. I have heard both options. There's actually, I think, a product out there. It's like the security electrocutor, not approved by HR. So when we're taking action on user risk, there's a really important place for us to start, and I was mentioning this earlier, it's mapping cohorts. Mapping groups of risk so that we can start focusing our attention and our resources appropriately to where it lies. And we've talked about one parameter a lot in the research, which is frequency. How many mistakes does a person make again and again? There's a second component that's really worth considering, which is severity, right? One malware instance is not the same thing as a browsing violation. And so I wanted to introduce this particular concept of with the X and Y chart of severity and frequency. And when an employee falls into one of these four quadrants, there's going to be very different ways that we should think about them as a risky user. Now, if someone is in the bottom left, right, there's low severity and low frequency, they're mere mortals. They're human. They're going to maybe fall for one or two mistakes, and it has very little consequence. So this might be falling for a simulated phishing attack, right? We probably will give them some training and go about our day. If we go up to the upper left quadrant, we have our victim here, right? So making one security mistake that has immense severity here. Now, there's very little what we can do about this from a proactive perspective. This is not a person who is high risk by nature. They would not be coming up in our data sets because they're not making repeated security mistakes. They are in the wrong time, in the wrong place. They happen to have a particular type of software running on their machine, for example. But anyway, they're in the crosshairs, and it's just not their lucky day. And this does happen. And this is why you need excellent detection and response capabilities to be able to try to recover from this kind of attack. But we have some interesting opportunities as we move to the bottom left, where we have our serial offenders, people who are making repeat offenses, making frequent mistakes that are not super catastrophic, but they're clearly skirting policy violations, pushing the edges here. As a side note, this is an interesting place to look for potential future malicious insider threats. Insider threat folks tend to see if they can get away with policy violations, nothing too severe yet, and if nothing gets reprimanded, they'll do it again and again, and occasionally with more severe outcomes towards the end. But we're taking a look at high-risk employees who exhibit constantly risky behavior. And then we're left with the last category of people who have frequent and severe actions. Those folks are probably not long for the organization and do maybe require a little bit more of an egregious remediation. So now we can understand that there's different types of risk, both severity and frequency. I now want to pivot the conversation to talk about interventions. So first I want to bring your attention on this slide to this bell curve that's on the back. We talked about the high-risk population that on average is about 12% of a workforce falling into these red folks towards the back, where a large portion of the population is going to be green, so very low risk. And we're seeing that this distribution of high-risk employees does fall along this bell curve. And folks in different parts of this bell curve require different levels of intervention. Now, this is a significantly different way of thinking about how we manage user risk in our organizations today, where now it's hey, everybody go through the same training, thanks. We start mapping user risk appropriate to type of interventions available to us. I'm going to unpack what these intervention looks like in a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I want to bring your attention to is the X and Y axis here. So we have business impact and protection. So when we have something in stage 0 like training, very little business impact, right? It's not really going to disrupt the business too much if we ask someone to take a few minutes security training, but relatively low protection around this. You know, if security training had worked for our industry, if security employees would have worked decades ago. It's minimally effective. As we move up this, we can see that we have a little bit more business impact. The stakes are a little bit higher, but so is the protection that we get in this. At the very end here, firing somebody is excellent protection from a security perspective, but also heavy business impact, right? That might be a really critical person to our workforce. So thinking about how we balance the two, right? It's really important that we maintain security posture in our organization, a resilient organization, but we also want to make sure that our businesses are thriving, making sure that we have minimize the amount of friction for employees. And so each of the stages that we have has different levels of value to us. So the first, while minimal protection, meets compliance. Training is maybe quite valuable for people who maybe never get a phishing email or never click on it. So those are excellent people first for one set of category. As we move up, we have feedback. First to the employee and then escalating to manager. And I'm going to walk through a little bit what that could look like once we actually have data. And then we're moving into a new capability that I'm only now beginning to see conversations around in the industry, which is thinking about how do we apply our security technology and controls, access to what I affectionately say is bubble wrapping these risky employees so that they minimize the harm to themselves and to the organization. And then the final option, if necessary, is this HR option. And what's interesting to note here is that there's actually different owners for each of these type of interventions. So we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but you'll see that managing user risk is actually a team sport where there's many stakeholders associated with this. So what this looks like in practice, if we start creating a little bit more color to what we're talking about, if we have a low-risk employee who's doing a great job, the feedback we're giving them is high five and kudos. So you're doing a great job, keep it up, right? If we have a medium-risk employee who's introducing maybe not severe things, but there's a frequency associated with it, maybe we're updating to manager. But then when we have a high-risk employee, either by severity or by frequency, feedback's not going to cut it. We're going to start thinking about the controls and the policies that we have in place. I want to take this one level deeper and give you a little bit of insight as to what this could look like. Because we now have data as to what an individual level of risk is, where they are in that bell curve, the type of feedback we can provide for folks changes entirely. This is an example of what one of our enterprise consulting teams did. And what we found was that instead of communicating with a CVSS score, you can give somebody a track record and say, hey, you're doing an okay job, but compared to your peer group, you can do a little bit better, right? And so using data to provide feedback is much more effective than trying to make funny cartoons to get people to care. But why this is important, the feedback component aspect of it, is an important first step as you're leveling up, is that if we're moving to the place where we're adjusting controls and policies, this provides the business time to get context around the kind of conversations that you need to be having with them. Saying, hey, you're exhibiting this risk. If this continues, things are going to get a little bit more there's going to be a little bit more control to help manage our risk. And so you're providing trust and transparency with the organization around this data set. But if either the severity, the incident is too tricky or too high risk, or the frequency is becoming at a level that isn't effective anymore, we think about adjusting policies and controls. So I wanted to give you an example. So let's say, again, we're taking our high-risk engineer, Steven, and we are seeing that the feedback we're giving him is not effective. We can start thinking about adapting certain safeguards. This is the bubble wrap I was talking about, right? So this particular individual may need a different type of authentication, only allow access via VPN, and maybe more regular phishing training. If we have, again, a medium risk employee, and we might have different type of safeguards for this individual, right? So only 2FA encouraged, and certain types of access, more permissive access allowed, and reviewing policies quarterly as opposed to more frequently. And for low risk employees, maybe we have much more relaxed MFA restrictions at SSO only, a lot of testing out of training, and also very, very permissive policy reviews. So thinking about how we adapt the security policy to an individual based on their risk. Now, this is, again, something that is still very new, and how we think about adjusting our security technologies and controls to an individual level of risk to make sure that it is not too full of friction for an individual, but it is the correct level for the business to remain secure while the individual is still able to do their job as freely and with as much innovation as possible. And this inevitably ties into the concept of zero trust, right? When we think about how do we authenticate the person, which is appropriate to their risk conditions, today when we think about authentication, we think about it based on network posture, device posture, remote connection types, but context is absolutely everything. And if we continue to forgo the user part of this equation, so how risky is the individual who's trying to log into my environment, the person that is trying to get access to this, we aren't really solving for the full equation here. And again, by being able to understand who our highest risk users are at a given point in time, we're then able to make much more thoughtful decisions around how we manage our identity, how we're managing policies, and access. And to finish this up, I wanted to circle back on a point that I brought earlier, which is we all have a piece to play in this, and that user risk isn't one department or part of an organization that's responsible for this. There are quite a few teams that both have an input and a benefit from this. And so if we start with enterprise security or identity and access management or security engineering, we can see that these teams have really interesting data that can help paint this picture to create essentially this CVSS score for an individual. What's the device security posture? Does the person ignore their patching pretty regularly, or are they up to par? What's their password security status? What kind of access level? And then the benefit to these types of organizations group is that, again, as we were talking about, thinking about much more proactively what kind of policies you can adjust to folks. And how often do you need to review this person's access? Maybe this person has totally fine with their blast radius, or are they a high-risk user that needs to have their access reviewed more often? Incident response, probably the biggest stakeholder in this conversation. There's so much critical data here available around who our risky individuals are. So instead of just cleaning up after an individual who's making a mistake, thinking through, how do I make sure to be able to be proactive and prevent this from happening? So lots of really interesting data sets available in this particular group. And the benefit to these particular individuals is that if you have a high risk or high confidence alert matched with a high risk user, there's a really good chance that that's something that requires prioritization in your review. Where a low risk alert with a low risk user probably can wait for another day. And then security training and awareness, a little bit more expected, simulated phishing and training, but the output here is we're able to actually identify which parts of the organization need greatest amount of time and attention, and actually for the first time in this particular field, start demonstrating a return on investment. There are also secondary teams associated with this, so audit, GRC, help desk, for example, for folks who are particularly vulnerable to account takeover, for example, can be informed for help desk triage. So to wrap this up, when we take a look at user risk, the way that we are thinking about it across the organization is quite antiquated, with the best practices being the same things we've done 20 years ago. And it is our largest opportunity to rethink about how we defend our organizations. And the good news is it's not distributed evenly. So there's a small number of users who are responsible for a disproportionately large number of risks in our organization. And there's absolutely a way that we can measure it. And we just talked about data sets from some three categories, but in the previous slide I showed you there's a lot of other inputs and data sets we can use to start thinking about user risk from multiple dimensions. By being able to quantify this risk, not only can we better secure organizations against these high-risk users, we can also acknowledge people who have really great track records and reduce the amount of security friction that we have for those, which is quite a unique concept for us. And in general, if we just take a step back, the ability to start quantifying user risk enables us to adapt our security to the right level for each individual, which is a revolutionary concept to how we've been thinking about security in general. And it unlocks a huge potential for how we defend our organization. With that, this is the link to the full research report if you're interested in learning more. And thank you all very much.